There is a voice in the silence that no one else hears, a shadow that follows you, not behind, but within. Have you ever sat in a room filled with light and still felt the chill of darkness pressing against your chest? Not from without, but from a place deeper than bone and breath. That is the inner enemy. It has no face, yet it stares through your eyes. It wears your voice like a mask. It waits not in the world, but in your hesitation, your self-doubt, your quiet agreement with fear. This enemy does not shout, it whispers, it doesn't strike, it convinces, it feeds not on defeat, but on delay. We speak often of obstacles, people, systems, circumstances, but what if the most formidable wall is not built of stone or structure, but thought? What if the cage is crafted from old wounds disguised as wisdom, and every bar is forged from a belief you never questioned? The inner enemy is subtle. It hides in your perfectionism, disguised as ambition. It lives in your comparison, masquerading as motivation. It lingers in your need to be liked, calling it self-love. It tells you to wait until you're ready, but readiness never comes because the enemy is the one telling you to wait. You see, this isn't a battle of swords, it's a war of mirrors. Every time you flinch from your reflection, every time you look away from your own becoming, the enemy wins. But here's the secret it doesn't want you to know. The inner enemy is not destroyed by force. It is dissolved by presence. Stillness exposes it. Honesty disarms it. Awareness burns through its illusions like morning sun through mist. You defeat it not by yelling louder, but by listening deeper. By daring to sit with the discomfort it tries so hard to avoid. By asking the questions that fracture its foundation. Who told me this story? Whose voice am I echoing? What am I protecting that no longer protects me? The moment you become fully present with yourself, unfiltered, unedited, unmasked, the inner enemy begins to fade, because its power was never in its truth, but in your silence. And once you speak, once you see, once you no longer resist the weight of your own reality, it loses its grip. The journey is not to conquer the self, but to uncover it, not to silence the fear, but to understand it, because beneath the enemy is not emptiness, but you, not the version you've been rehearsing, not the one who pleases or performs, but the one who remembers, and that remembering is how the inner enemy is finally undone. There are battles we prepare for all our lives, battles of survival, of achievement, of recognition. We armor ourselves with education, with strategy, with social armor, thinking the world outside is the true battleground. But there comes a quiet, disorienting moment in every honest life when you realize the greatest conflict is not out there, it's in here. Inside, beneath the skin and under the smile, it's not your parents, your past, your failures, or even your enemies that have held you captive. It's the echo of your own voice, distorted by fear and shaped by years of unconscious agreement. That is the inner enemy, a voice so familiar that you mistake it for truth. It doesn't show up as a villain. It's too clever for that. No, it dresses in your language, speaks in your cadence, and wears your logic. It sounds like concern. It sounds like reason. It says, you should wait until you're more prepared. It whispers, you're not the kind of person who succeeds at this. It questions, who do you think you are? And the tragedy is not that it speaks, but that you believe it, that you obey it, that you let it dictate the speed, the scope, the direction of your becoming. This voice is not born, it is constructed. It is the slow accumulation of moments when you absorb the world's doubt. Every time someone told you to be realistic, to shrink, to sit still. Every time love was withdrawn unless you performed. Every time failure was met with shame instead of learning. These experiences did not just pass through you. They planted seeds. And with repetition, those seeds grew roots. They became narratives. Narratives became identity, and identity became destiny. Until one day, you are no longer moving through the world freely, but through a maze of invisible walls that you helped build. You start to self-police. You limit yourself before the world even has the chance to do it for you. You censor your dreams, edit your voice, dilute your passion, all to stay within the bounds of the familiar, the safe, the acceptable. But what you call safety is often a subtle form of self-abandonment. You are protecting a version of yourself that no longer needs protecting. And in doing so, you betray the one within you that is still longing to rise. The inner enemy does not fear your failures. It fears your awakening, because once you wake up, once you see it clearly, it loses its camouflage. Its power comes not from its presence, but from your belief in its authority. It can only control you when you mistake it for wisdom. But pause for a moment and ask, is this caution, or is this fear dressed in logic? Is this humility, or have I just become fluent in self-rejection? These questions begin to pull the thread. They unravel the tightly woven fabric of false identity. The inner enemy does not like questions. It thrives in the unquestioned, in the assumptions you've never examined. It loves autopilot. It loves routine. It loves when you confuse comfort with peace, because comfort can be a cage if it keeps you from growth, and the inner enemy is a master warden, keeping the cell clean, the lights dim, the walls familiar. You may not even realize you're imprisoned, because the bars look like your own hands. There is something haunting about how early this voice begins. As children, we don't yet know how to distinguish between what is true and what is absorbed. So, when we feel unloved, we assume we are unlovable. When we are ignored, we assume we are invisible. When we are rejected, we assume we are inherently wrong. The mind, in its innocence, translates experience into identity. And once formed, that identity doesn't sit quietly. It governs. It chooses your relationships. It dictates your risks. It shapes your expectations. And you think you're making choices, but often, you're simply obeying old pain. The inner enemy is rarely loud. Loudness would alert you. It speaks instead in soft tones, in familiar phrases. You begin to repeat it in your inner dialogue. You hear it when you're standing on the edge of a dream, when you're about to say yes to something bigger than you've known. And just as you take a breath, it whispers, "Be careful. Remember last time. You don't want to get hurt again." It sounds protective, but its real motive is control. Because what it fears most is your freedom. Your freedom threatens its existence. The enemy within is not a singular voice. It is a council of ghosts. The voice of your critical parent. The voice of the teacher who said you'd never be enough. The friend who betrayed you. The failure that humiliated you. The heartbreak that shattered you. These moments never resolved. They echoed. They reverberated through your psyche until they became part of your inner vocabulary. And without knowing it, you carry their judgments into every opportunity, every challenge, every new beginning, not because they are true, but because they are familiar. You can dress it up. You can achieve. You can impress. You can accumulate degrees, followers, titles. But if the inner enemy still lives untouched, undetected, undefeated, it will sabotage you from within. It will raise its voice the moment you get too close to your own greatness. It will convince you to settle for less, not because it hates you, but because it only understands survival, not evolution. Its job was to protect you when you were fragile. But you are not fragile anymore. And yet, the enemy doesn't know that unless you show it. The most dangerous thing about the inner enemy is that it doesn't need to destroy you to win. It only needs to delay you, delay your voice, delay your leap. Delay your healing. It wins every time you say maybe later instead of now. Every time you retreat when you're meant to step forward. Every time you listen to the lie that says you're not ready. But readiness is not a destination. It's a decision. And the longer you wait for the voice within to disappear before you act, the more rooted it becomes. To face the inner enemy is not an act of violence. It is an act of courage. It's not about silencing the voice, but about understanding it. Asking it where it learned what it believes, challenging the narratives it repeats. You begin to trace its origins. You start to see that this voice, so convincing, so authoritative, is often a scared child trapped in a grown body, clinging to outdated survival strategies. You don't need to kill this part of you. You need to parent it, guide it, teach it that the world it once feared no longer exists. This is not a one-time reckoning. The inner enemy is persistent. It returns. It evolves. It changes form. Sometimes it shows up as imposter syndrome, other times as jealousy, sometimes as hyper-productivity or emotional numbness. It has many faces, but the root is the same, the belief that you are not enough as you are. The moment you stop feeding that belief, the enemy begins to starve. And yet, the irony is this: the inner enemy is also your greatest teacher, because it shows you where you are not yet free. It reveals the exact point where your healing is incomplete. Every lie it tells is an invitation to return to yourself, to excavate, to rewire, to reclaim. Without it, you might never learn to listen more deeply, to question more bravely, to love yourself more honestly. In that way, the inner enemy does not stand in the way of your path. It is the path. And so, the journey continues, not outward, but inward, not toward conquest, but clarity. Each step forward is not an act of aggression against the inner enemy, but a commitment to no longer build your life according to its script. You are not its prisoner, you are its witness, and in that witnessing, you begin to remember the truth. Not the truth the voice told you, but the one that existed before it ever learned to speak. There is a peculiar kind of suffering that hides in plain sight, a suffering that wears the mask of composure, smiles at all the right moments, performs all the necessary rituals of normalcy, and yet trembles silently beneath it all. This suffering is the playground of the inner enemy. It is not loud or chaotic, because it does not need to be. It thrives in quiet places, in subtle decisions, postponed conversations, and the unspoken fears we fold neatly beneath our daily routines. The inner enemy is not fueled by crisis, but by neglect. It does not require a breakdown to gain power. All it asks is that you look away, that you distract yourself just long enough to forget what's rising within you. Avoidance becomes its nourishment. Every emotion you deny, every truth you suppress, every longing you mute, becomes another brick in the wall it builds around you. And you believe, perhaps, that you are being strong, that you are managing, coping, surviving. But there is a vast difference between surviving and living. And somewhere along the line, the soul begins to notice the difference. The body starts to carry the weight of what the mind refuses to face. Anxiety is often not an enemy in itself. It is the body's rebellion against the silence. It is what happens when too much truth goes unspoken for too long. We are taught to avoid discomfort. From childhood, we are soothed, distracted, redirected whenever pain surfaces. A crying child is often told to stop, a fearful thought brushed aside with forced optimism. We learn quickly that vulnerability is unsafe and that pain is to be ignored or numbed. And so we grow into adults who have mastered the art of emotional avoidance. We don't cry, we stay strong. We don't question, we trust the process. We don't confront, we keep the peace. But that peace is often purchased with the currency of our own authenticity. It is not true peace. It is avoidance in disguise. The inner enemy delights in this kind of false peace, because as long as you avoid the mess within, you never clean it. You just learn to walk around it, build your life around it, pretend it isn't there. But all the while, it festers. The conversations you never had, the boundaries you never set, the grief you never mourned. They don't disappear. They wait. Like ghosts in the hallway of your mind, they linger. And the inner enemy uses them to shape your behavior, to make you shrink, to make you doubt, to keep you tethered to the versions of yourself you were supposed to outgrow. It is subtle, this inner war. You feel it when you procrastinate on something meaningful, telling yourself you're just tired, when deep down you're afraid of failing. You feel it when you avoid silence, needing constant noise or distraction, because quiet makes the whispers louder. You feel it when you smile and nod even though your soul is begging you to speak. In those moments, the enemy is not some external force pushing against you. It is the part of you that has learned to fear your own truth. Avoidance becomes a kind of self-betrayal. Every time you bypass what you truly feel to maintain comfort, you send yourself a message that your truth is too heavy to carry, too inconvenient to honor. Over time, this breeds a quiet resentment, not just toward others, but toward yourself. You begin to mistrust your own instincts, question your desires, suppress your voice. The inner enemy becomes your interpreter, translating your thoughts through the lens of fear and limitation. And because you have not practiced facing discomfort, you obey without question. Silence, too, is not merely the absence of sound. It is the absence of expression, the absence of confrontation, the absence of truth-telling. It is the space where pain grows unnamed and unchallenged. You can be surrounded by people, loved even, and still feel entirely unknown if you never speak from the center of your being. The inner enemy is not concerned with whether or not others understand you. It only needs you to stay misunderstood by yourself. Because once you understand what you really feel, what you really need, what you really believe, you become dangerous to it. Most people don't avoid their truth because they are weak. They avoid it because at some point, facing the truth cost them something. Maybe it cost them love. Maybe it cost them acceptance. Maybe it disrupted the illusion of control. And so they learned that avoidance was safer. But the safety is an illusion. The longer you delay facing yourself, the more complex the layers become. The more entangled your behavior grows with defense mechanisms. The more you adapt to survive instead of transform to thrive. The inner enemy does not come to you with sharp teeth and snarling threats. It comes as a whisper, let it go, it's not worth it, just move on, you're fine. It pacifies you with half-truths and spiritual bypassing. It tells you that forgiveness means forgetting, that healing means pretending, that growth means never being angry. But true healing requires you to feel what you've refused to feel, to say what you were told not to say, to unearth the parts of yourself buried beneath layers of silence. And it takes courage, not the kind of courage that shows up in dramatic gestures, but the quiet, persistent kind, the kind that sits with discomfort without numbing it, that asks hard questions without rushing to answers, that allows space for grief, for confusion, for anger, without needing to resolve it immediately, the courage to sit in your own presence and say, this is where I am, this is what I feel, this is what I need. The inner enemy cannot survive in that kind of honesty. It dissolves in the presence of raw, unfiltered truth. We often imagine the inner work of healing as something poetic and beautiful, and sometimes it is. But often it is inconvenient. It interrupts your plans. It challenges your relationships. It forces you to slow down when everything in you wants to speed up. It brings you face to face with the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. The jealous part, the insecure part, the ashamed part, the angry part. And it asks you not to fix them, but to acknowledge them, to welcome them back into your awareness with compassion. The reason the inner enemy thrives in avoidance is because avoidance fragments you. It separates you from yourself, and in that separation, the voice of fear becomes the loudest. It goes unchecked. It begins to shape your reality without your conscious permission. You begin to see the world not as it is, but through the lens of your unhealed narratives. You mistake caution for wisdom. You confuse guilt for conscience. You believe that staying small is the same as staying safe. And slowly, quietly, your life becomes a reflection of your unspoken fears instead of your deepest truths. There is no way to eradicate fear completely. It is part of being human, but fear that is met with honesty loses its grip. When you stop running from what you feel, what you believe, what you desire, the fear loses its mystery. It stops being a monster in the shadows and becomes a message in the light. And often, when you finally face what you've been avoiding, you realize it wasn't as monstrous as you imagined. The anticipation of pain is often more terrifying than the pain itself. To live fully is to refuse to live in avoidance. It is to create space in your life for discomfort, knowing that it is a sign not of something going wrong, but of something trying to change. It is to trust that your soul is capable of holding pain and joy, grief and gratitude, sorrow and purpose, all at once. The inner enemy cannot function in a space that allows for complexity. It needs you to believe in black and white thinking, that you are either good or bad, strong or weak, healed or broken. But life is not lived in such absolutes. Healing is not linear. Growth is not clean, and truth is not always convenient. When you make the decision to stop avoiding yourself, you begin a revolution. Not a loud one, not a glamorous one, but a sacred one. One that begins with a whisper, "I am ready to hear myself again." You open the door to every part of yourself that has waited in silence. You make room for the full truth, not just the parts that are palatable, but the parts that are messy, uncomfortable, and real. And in doing so, you begin to dismantle the power of the inner enemy, not by fighting it, but by no longer feeding it the silence it requires to survive. There is a sacred language the soul speaks, but it is only heard in stillness. In a world that exalts speed, performance, and constant engagement, stillness is often mistaken for idleness or weakness. Yet, it is in stillness that the unseen currents of life begin to reveal themselves. It is in the quiet that truth rises, not the truth shaped by opinion or conditioned by fear, but the deep, ancient truth that lives beneath identity, beyond ego, beyond the ever-turning wheel of external striving. Stillness is not the absence of movement, but the presence of attention, and attention, directed inward, becomes the gateway to transformation. Most people are not afraid of change. They are afraid of the stillness that precedes it. Because in stillness, you begin to hear the parts of yourself you've silenced for years. The unresolved grief, the lingering doubt, the buried longing, the unlived dreams. They begin to stir when the noise dies down. And it is here that self-awareness begins its delicate work. It does not barge in, it does not demand, it waits, quiet, patient, persistent, until you are ready to see, until you are brave enough to feel. Self-awareness is the mirror no one can hold up for you. It is a mirror only revealed when you sit long enough with your own presence to witness what lies behind your eyes. It is the courage to question your motives, your patterns, your defenses, not with judgment, but with curiosity. It is the willingness to ask, what is actually driving me? What am I avoiding? Where am I pretending? These questions are not small. They are disruptive. They unsettle the carefully arranged scaffolding of identity you've built over the years. But in their disruption, they offer you something far more valuable than comfort. They offer you clarity. Transformation does not begin in grand gestures or dramatic shifts. It begins in the moment you decide to stop running from yourself. In the moment you choose to sit in stillness long enough to remember who you are beneath the performance, beneath the fear, beneath the survival strategies you've mistaken for personality. The world around you is loud, but the soul is subtle. It does not compete for attention, it waits for it. And when you finally grant it that sacred pause, it begins to speak, not in words, but in knowing. There is power in presence, not the kind of presence that demands recognition, but the kind that holds space without needing to fill it. When you are truly present, you begin to notice the invisible patterns that govern your life. You see how certain triggers hijack your emotions. You see how old wounds influence new decisions. You begin to separate your thoughts from your truth, your reactions from your essence. And in that separation, you create space, a space where choice can be born. Before self-awareness, there is only reaction. After self-awareness, there is response. And that shift from unconscious reaction to conscious response is the birth of transformation. Stillness is not easy. It brings discomfort. It dismantles illusion. It slows the momentum of distraction. And most people would rather stay busy than be honest. Because when you slow down, you can no longer outrun yourself. You can no longer blame the noise for your disconnection. You are left with what is real. And what is real may not be polished or palatable, but it is yours. It is the ground upon which everything true must be built. Transformation is not about becoming something new. It is about remembering something eternal, and that remembering requires stillness. To be still is not to disengage from life, but to re-engage with it from a place of depth. The world does not need more performance. It needs presence. It needs individuals who are rooted in themselves, not swayed by every trend or triggered by every change. And that kind of rootedness only comes from knowing yourself, not the self others taught you to be, but the one that existed before fear made you forget. Stillness brings you back to that place. It allows the dust to settle so you can see clearly. Self-awareness is not always comfortable. It reveals where you are complicit in your own suffering. It shows you how you've participated in the very patterns you claim to hate. It shines a light on your inconsistencies, your projections, your ego's need for control. But it also reveals your capacity for healing, your ability to choose differently, your strength not in perfection, but in presence. You begin to see that your triggers are not flaws, they are portals. They show you where your wounds still live, and instead of reacting from them, you begin to respond to them with compassion. That is how transformation begins, not through force, but through awareness. The mind is a master storyteller. It creates narratives to protect you, to justify you, to insulate you from pain. But many of these narratives are outdated. They were written during times of trauma, confusion, or fear. And though they served a purpose once, they often become prisons over time. Self-awareness allows you to revise the story, to step back and ask, is this still true? Is this still serving me? But you cannot ask those questions from a place of busyness. You must be still, you must listen, you must be willing to see what you've avoided. Stillness softens the grip of control. It teaches you to trust the unfolding. It opens you to intuition, to inner guidance that cannot be accessed through logic alone. In stillness, you begin to feel your life from the inside out. And that feeling, that deep inner resonance, becomes your compass. It tells you where there is alignment and where there is distortion. It shows you not what the world expects of you, but what your soul longs to express. And once you've tasted that kind of clarity, you can no longer settle for the noise. Transformation is not linear. It spirals, it circles back, it deepens, and the more self-aware you become, the more layers you uncover. It is humbling work. Just when you think you've healed something, life presents it to you again, this time at a deeper level. But stillness gives you the tools to stay present through the unraveling. It teaches you that discomfort is not a sign of regression, but of expansion. That every time you meet your shadow with awareness instead of avoidance, you reclaim a piece of yourself. We live in a culture that rewards productivity but punishes introspection. There is no medal for sitting with your pain, no applause for feeling deeply. But these are the moments that shape you, not the ones you post, but the ones you carry in silence, the hours you spend facing yourself, the decisions you make when no one is watching, the way you choose presence over performance, truth over comfort, awareness over avoidance. These are the sacred acts that rewrite your life from the inside out. Stillness and self-awareness are not separate. They are interwoven. Stillness creates the conditions for self-awareness to arise, and self-awareness deepens your capacity to be still. Together, they dismantle illusion. They burn away the false so the real can emerge. They are not easy paths, but they are true ones. And in a world obsessed with shortcuts and surface solutions, truth is a rare and radiant gift. You do not transform by adding more to yourself. You transform by stripping away the noise, the conditioning, the performance, the masks. You transform by returning to the still point within you, returning to the observer who watches without judgment, returning to the awareness that knows the difference between your fear and your intuition. That return is not flashy, it is quiet, but it is the most powerful movement you will ever make, and you will be tempted again and again to abandon it, to rush back into distraction, to fill the silence with sound, to move instead of feel. But every time you choose stillness, you plant a seed of truth, a seed of presence, a seed that over time grows into a life rooted in awareness instead of reactivity, purpose instead of performance, clarity instead of confusion. The world may not notice that kind of transformation at first. It does not shimmer or shout, but those who are still can sense it in you. They feel the difference in your energy, your words, your choices. Because when you become still, you become spacious, and in that space, others feel safe to become still too. Your presence becomes a quiet permission for others to feel, to listen, to wake up. So the work continues. In stillness, in awareness, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Because the path of true transformation is not found in the external rearrangement of life, but in the quiet revolution within. There is a kind of amnesia that creeps into the soul, not all at once, but slowly, gradually, over years of bending, pleasing, proving, and surviving. You don't notice it at first. It hides beneath the expectations you accept without question, the roles you play to belong, the compromises you make to feel safe. At first, it looks like adaptation. It feels like maturity. It seems like wisdom. But over time, you begin to feel a quiet ache, an inexplicable fatigue, not just in the body, but in the spirit. It's not burnout from doing too much, but the exhaustion of being too little of yourself for too long. The world applauds your performance, but somewhere deep inside, you start to hear the soft, persistent echo of something forgotten. And that echo is the beginning of your remembering. True victory, the kind that cannot be taken or shaken, does not come from conquering the world. It comes from reclaiming yourself, from peeling back the layers of conditioning and defense until what remains is not a version of you shaped by survival, but the essence of who you were before fear taught you to hide. This victory is not loud. It does not arrive with fanfare or public recognition. It is quiet and intimate, often unglamorous, always profound. It is the moment you realize that all the striving, all the comparison, All the battles you fought to be enough were based on a lie you no longer need to believe. You were never meant to prove your worth. You were meant to live from it. But when you forget who you are, you start living for applause instead of alignment. You trade authenticity for approval, and in that transaction, something sacred is lost. You become a stranger to yourself, still functioning, still succeeding perhaps, but disconnected. You speak, but your words feel hollow. You smile, but your joy feels thin. You wake up, but you no longer feel awake. That disconnection is not failure. It is a signal. It is your soul calling you home. Remembering who you are is not about returning to a fixed identity. It is not about becoming what you were before the world changed you. It is about remembering what never changed. That core of you that remained intact even through heartbreak, disappointment, betrayal, and loss. The you that existed before the world convinced you to shrink. It is not a persona. It is not a brand. It is not the version of you that knows what to say to be liked. It is the wordless center, the part of you that feels most like truth. Victory begins there, not on a battlefield, but in the stillness of recognition. Not in pushing forward, but in turning inward. The mind will resist it. It will tell you there's no time. It will warn you that you'll fall behind, be forgotten, lose momentum. But these are the voices of fear, not wisdom. They want you to forget because memory is power. When you remember who you are, you cannot be manipulated. You cannot be bought. You cannot be shamed into submission or coerced into conformity. You become unshakable, not because you are perfect, but because you are rooted. The world teaches us to seek identity through accumulation of titles, possessions, accomplishments, followers. But none of these things, however impressive, can hold the weight of your being. When identity is outsourced to external things, it becomes fragile. It rises and falls with the market, with opinion, with performance. But when identity is rooted in remembrance, it becomes eternal. You no longer need to chase validation because you are anchored in truth. And that anchoring is where real freedom lives. There is a sacred defiance in remembering who you are, because the world benefits from your forgetting. It benefits when you doubt yourself, when you defer to others, when you stay small and silent. But you were not born to fit in. You were born to express the divine pattern only you carry, and remembering that is not arrogance. It is obedience to your own design. It is the rejection of every lie that ever told you you were too much or not enough. It is the refusal to live a life dictated by fear, scarcity, or imitation. You don't remember all at once. The remembering comes in waves, in whispers, in sudden clarity. It might come in a moment of heartbreak when everything familiar falls away and only the truth remains. It might come in silence, when you stop performing long enough to feel your own presence again. It might come in a conversation, in a line of a book, in the stillness of nature. And when it comes, it will feel both startling and familiar, like waking up in a place you've never been but somehow always known. There will be resistance, because remembering who you are often means letting go of who you thought you had to be. And that letting go is a kind of dying. You may grieve the identities you wore to survive, the roles you played to be loved, the versions of yourself you built to belong. But in that grief, there is also relief, because the truth is lighter than the mask, and your soul has been waiting patiently beneath it all, whispering, "There is more to you than this." Victory is not in being untouched by pain. It is in not being defined by it. It is in meeting every wound with the awareness that you are more than what happened to you, that your worth is not contingent on being understood, validated, or successful by someone else's measure, that your power lies not in control, but in surrender to your own truth, your own path, your own becoming, that surrender is not weakness. It is the boldest act of remembrance, When you remember who you are, you stop trying to earn love and start embodying it. You stop striving to be chosen and start choosing yourself. You stop performing for the world and start expressing from your soul. You begin to move differently, speak differently, love differently. You become less reactive, more intentional. Less anxious, more anchored. Not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. You are no longer negotiating your essence for acceptance. You are no longer asleep in your own life. This remembrance is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong practice. There will be days you forget again. Days when fear speaks louder than truth. Days when the old patterns resurface. But even then, the remembering lives in you. It is not lost. It is simply waiting. Beneath the noise, beneath the doubt, beneath the illusion. You need only return, again and again, gently, without shame, without punishment. Because the soul does not demand perfection. It asks only for presence. Every act of remembrance is a rebellion against the forgetting. Every time you choose authenticity over approval, you reclaim a piece of yourself. Every time you speak your truth, even when your voice shakes, you come home a little more. Every time you pause and listen to the wisdom within, even when the world is shouting, you strengthen your foundation. These are the quiet victories that reshape a life. You begin to see the world not as a battlefield, but as a mirror, reflecting back to you the parts of yourself you're ready to see. The challenges no longer feel like punishments but invitations. The people who trigger you become teachers. The losses become gateways. Everything begins to serve your awakening, not your ego. And in that shift, victory is no longer something to chase. It becomes the natural consequence of remembrance. There is a kind of peace that comes when you no longer need to convince anyone of your value. When you no longer need to curate your life to be worthy of love. When you can stand in your own presence and feel enough. That peace is not complacency. It is power. It is the foundation from which true impact flows. Not forced, not performative, but magnetic and real. Because people can feel when you are rooted in truth. They may not understand it, but they will feel it. And some will be drawn to it. Others will resist it. But that is not your concern. Your task is to remember. And as you remember, you become a permission slip for others. Your presence says, you don't have to be anything but yourself here. Your truth says, you are allowed to take up space. Your authenticity says, there is nothing wrong with who you are. In this way, your victory becomes collective, not in a performative way, but in the quiet ripple of truth touching truth, light calling to light, soul recognizing soul. There will always be voices, external and internal, that try to convince you otherwise, that tell you you're too late, too broken, too strange, too much. But those voices are not the voice of truth. They are echoes of fear, of history, of projection. The voice of truth is quieter but clearer. It says, you were never lost, you only forgot. It says, you don't have to earn your place. It says, come home, everything you've been looking for is already within you. And so you return, not to a past version of yourself, but to the essence that existed before the world wrote its story over yours. You return to the place where your worth was never in question, where your presence was always enough, where your truth was never too much. And in that returning, you reclaim your life, not the life that was expected of you, but the one that was always meant for you, the life that only you can live, the life that begins with remembering.